Yes, this is a good opportunity. I like going out and being able to talk to the developers of the world who seem to give us headaches and what we're trying to do, obviously. We want to make everything that can run under Windows accessible, and that's no small task. So I think what I'd like to do is kind of back up, way back, give a little bit of a history of how screen readers have gone, hopefully give you a good understanding of the difficulties that we run into, some of the successes that we've had, and how you guys can actually help us being able to promote things, build accessibility from the ground up, and things just work. There's lots of tools out there to use, almost too many in some respects. It's like that saying, the good thing about standards is there's so many to choose from, and there almost are so many out there to choose from. So it's a little bit confusing from your perspective of what you should do to even make it accessible. So hopefully, with Victor being here in Yahoo, he's a great focal point for you guys. If you do have problems, he knows how to get a hold of us. We can help. We have some of our web page goes in and talks to developers of how you can do things, make things accessible and things like that. But again, going way back, I started in this maybe in the early 80s sometime, back when the Apple II first came out. So I bought my first Apple II in '79, and that's what kind of got me hooked in computers to begin with. But back in that time frame, there was no such thing as a screen reader. Every application that we wrote back in those days to be used by blind individuals was self-voicing. So I had written a talking word processor, for instance, or a talking database, or talking telecommunication. All of these things were self-voicing, and at the time that was state-of-the-art, and that was acceptable. The problem is a blind person come work for Yahoo, which wasn't around back then, and they would sit down with their coworkers who might have been at the time maybe using, I forget what even the word processors were on the Apple II, but they're using standard word processors, and me as a blind user, I have to use my dedicated talking application, totally different than what everybody else is, may not be able to even save in that format. So it again segregates the blind person from the sighted world. But at the time, that was all that you could do. So then IBM, of course, came out with DOS, and that was a huge step forward. Now at that point, a blind person could actually use the same applications that a sighted person was using. And so at that point, they had what they called TSRs, those terminate and stay resident utilities under DOS. And so that was the very first time that you saw a real screen reader come out in the market, a serious one. The Apple II really, it sort of had one because you could run one at the command prompt and things, but you couldn't really run applications with it. Where under DOS, now you could actually run some serious applications. So it's a utility that's always running, and in DOS's case, it was easy because it was an 80 by 25 text screen, no graphics really to deal with. You could easily get the text from the video card. It was, even if you didn't catch it as it went to the screen, you can easily query it later from the video card. So relatively speaking, it was simple, although in the times it was still very difficult even to handle with some of these applications that are using visual indicators to show where highlights are and things like that. So that went on for several years. And actually, I'd written the DOS screen reader called Vocalize, which at the time did grow to be the #1 DOS screen reader. But then Microsoft, of course, came out with Windows and changed all of that. And in some respects for the good. In DOS, there was no standard. Everybody kind of did their own thing. How you highlight things, how you represent a cursor or the focus and things like that. There was absolutely no standard. Menu systems were all self-designed. Everybody had a different interface. So when Windows came out, we thought that would be a very positive step forward because a button's a button. So if you make one button accessible, anybody that uses that same Win32 button is going to be accessible. The same with menus and things like that. So at first, things were looking really good because everybody used standard controls. Of course, the problem is everybody looked alike. And so the first thing that everybody started doing was, how can I make myself stand out from the crowd? And so they start writing their own gadgets and widgets and things, which again sets us back to ground zero that we have to deal with. And so we'll talk about some of the ways that you can actually deal with that as we do that. So under Windows, under DOS, I was saying that we could easily go to the video card and get the text at any point. If the blind person said, what's the current line under the cursor? It was easy to find the cursor under DOS. It was easy to go to the video card and pull the text out and read it for them. Under Windows, of course, I'm running Windows Vista now, everything is pixels on the screen. We can't go to the video card now and say, what's the text? It's all pixels, it's all graphical. So we had to come up with a mechanism to be able to get to the text before it actually became rasterized or before it became pixels and represented in graphics on the screen. So what we did was we devised a mechanism back in the Windows 3.1 days where we'd actually patch in user and GDI. We're actually hooking into the operating system. So when an application does a patblit, we intercept that. We just hooked it right in there, so it jumps back into our code. We say that, we see all the parameters for the patblit. We store all that information or a text out. We're storing all of that stuff, and we keep our own database, an off-screen model of exactly representation of what's up on the screen. So we're seeing it before the video card sees it, and that way we get it as it is. We get it as text, we get it as graphics or whatever that might be up there. But if you can imagine, that's very difficult to keep everything in sync of what's really going on. Being able to make sure everything is clipped the way that it is, so you're representing what's really visual up on the screen and things like that. So it's a tremendous amount of work. And no screen reader out there is 100% accurate all the time with what's up there, just because it's so complex. I mean, if you have a W up on the screen and a window's half covering it, when that window goes away, Windows, of course, only draws half of the W. So what do you do with that? And so we somehow have to merge that in. And it's just that's a simple case, but there's a lot of examples of where things become very, very complex when they're going up there. So that's how we kind of did it originally back in the Windows 3.1, even 95, 98, Millennium. We just kind of hooked into user and GDI. When Windows XP came out, that actually had to change too, because it wasn't as easy to hook into that. So then what we did was we created our own video driver, and we just put it in the stream of the real video driver. So when you installed us, we go in and we changed the system to point to our video driver first, and then we chained on to the real video driver. So again, you didn't know what was going on, and we see it all coming through us and deal with that. One of the problems that immediately happened with that is we're not the only screen reader in town, or AT product even. If you put a screen magnifier in with us and they're doing the same thing, now all of a sudden we've got two fake video drivers in stream with the real video driver, and people didn't install and uninstall in the right direction, and things just, you're getting blue screens all over the place. And that's the problem too. When you start playing with video drivers, your system can blue screen. I mean, Windows can't recover from a kernel type blow up. So that's a problem. So we came up with a technology called DCM, Display Chain Manager, which basically allows all the AT products to coexist. And this little manager is actually handling the chaining and managing putting in and out video drivers and things like that. So several of the AT companies that use this, there's only like 4 of them, including ourselves, got together, wrote up the specs for that, proposed it to Microsoft. Then Microsoft actually hired or contracted our company out to develop that. So any AT product that's using a video driver today will be using this DCM. Now Vista came out, and Vista actually broke all of that too, because now we can't chain our video drivers as we did before. So now what we're doing is actually using mirror drivers, which is in some respects has been around for a long time, but it didn't have everything that we needed, and it's usually a little bit more secure that way with a mirror driver. If our mirror driver goes out, it doesn't take the whole system out necessarily. But so a mirror driver, what's happening, instead of the serial throughput where all the video drivers are in a stream and everybody's seeing them all the way through and hopefully passing them on to the real video driver untouched. Now it's a mirror driver, so it's kind of out in parallel. So all the mirror drivers get the information at once. Still getting the same information, we're just handling it a little bit differently. So that's the state that we're at today, or at least with Vista. So that's one big mechanism that we use, is the off-screen model. We have to have the off-screen model as our last resort backup of being able to represent information to a blind user. Because again, if the blind user is asking for information of what's under my line inside Microsoft Word, we have to be able to get that text. So the off-screen model is a big thing for us. Then the other tools that we use, again, as I mentioned, if you're using standard Win32 controls, we know how to talk to all of those controls. So if you're using a tree view, a list view, or any of those standard controls, it's a very rich and standard documentation on how to interact with those controls. We know how to do that. So if you can use standard controls, that's the best deal. If you're in a tree view, for instance, let me just bring up, actually let me do this. I'm just going to bring up, for example, a tree view over here.
Local disk C, Mac,
let me go deep into a tree view here. I think
GW, Internet Explorer, GW, manual.
Okay, that's deep enough. So right now I'm in a tree view, and even visually, I'm on the tree view in the Windows Explorer over there on the left side, and I'm pretty deep inside this tree view. Even visually, you can't really tell where I'm at. You know I'm in the sets directory, but you don't know where I'm at. So we've given the blind user ways of being able to find out even information that quickly that a sighted person can't easily find. But our speak summary, for instance,
expanded.
So it tells me it's expanded. It tells me 72 items, 2 of 3, depth 7, reads all the depths.
Depth 3 program files, depth 4 GW micro, depth 5 window eyes, depth 6.
So we can read the whole depth. So even visually you don't see that. And that's because, and it's kind of getting away from that screen reader, because back in the old days it was a screen reader. All you could do was access what's on the screen. Now we can actually talk directly to the controls, the application, and get rich information. So this tree view, we're able to get very rich information, tell you how many items are in there, what item you're on, index count, so as I'm down arrowing.
2K, 1 of 72.
So I know I'm on 1 of 72. It just gives them some information. Again, a sighted person can sit there and count, but it's kind of nice to get that. So if you're using standard controls, we can give you very rich information. The problem is, again, people want to set themselves different. So if you can take a standard control and subset off of that, and then add your extra whiz-bang functionality, that's even better yet. Well, it's not better yet, but it's still very feasible for us to still express the base functionality of that tree view. So what happens is you subclass off of a tree view and you call it my favorite tree view. Windows, when it comes up, isn't necessarily going to know that's a tree view at first, so it's going to say custom control when it comes to it. But a user can very easily, with one key press, say treat this control, which happens to be called my favorite tree view, treat that like a tree view. And so from that point on, we can, as long as you still based all the, when you subclass it, you still support all the base functionality, then we will still be able to treat and get that rich information. We may not be able to get your additional whiz-bang feature and functionality, but we can at least get the base functionality. So if you can subclass, that's good to do. Then the problem with that is back several years ago, I don't remember when, this MSAA or Microsoft Active Accessibility, which is an API that was necessary because the off-screen model wasn't doing it, because people were going away from standard controls. We still needed a mechanism to be able to communicate to the application to express rich information to the user. So Microsoft, again in cooperation with a lot of AT companies like ourselves, came up with the Microsoft Active Accessibility API, MSAA. And that's just, at the time it was pretty good. It definitely solved the problems of the time. But that allows us to be able to communicate. It's got a lot of documentation on it. It was poorly documented, it's a problem, and it leaves a lot of interpretation for the designer of how they actually interpret it. So we couldn't just make Windows be fully MSA compatible because everybody implemented it differently. They might use, you have names and states and roles and things like that, and they weren't consistent on how they were using it. And so we might treat it this way with this application, it read fine, over here it didn't, or in most cases in the early days, things would blow up. We would query some MSA information and things would just blow up. So we actually had to say, okay, we're not going to trust you until you've proven yourself. And so Windows actually wouldn't communicate to it with MSA until we opened up a gate for that application that said, okay, we trust you and we're going to deal with it. And we're still fighting with MSA today as far as the inconsistency of how it's implemented. So there are some people that are trying to document this a little bit better. I know in the Mozilla page, for instance, they're trying to come up with standard ways that you can represent information, even better documentation than what Microsoft has of ways that you can do that. But once you come up with a mechanism, if you can stay consistent with that and work with it even within your company, that would help a lot. But MSA has a lot of problems in that respect too. But one of the advantages of MSA, for instance, this is, let me just run. Let me just run Solitaire. Under previously, what we had to do with Solitaire, which this is a very poor example, but we want to make an application accessible, and Solitaire is a very graphical application that we want to try to make accessible. In the previous days, what we would have to do is we see all the blitz that come out for all these cards, and what we would have to do is we'd have to manually label those cards. We can label graphics. We know this graphic is different than this graphic. So we can label this graphic 9 of spades. We can label that 10 of spades, or whatever the case may be. So we had to label that. The problem is if you change your theming, if you change your color scheme, if you change your color resolution, these graphic images change slightly, which break our labels. You have to relabel them, and it just was very difficult to be able to manage that. But that's how we kind of had to deal with it in the past. Now what Microsoft did with Vista is they finally added some MSAA support to Solitaire. So now as I tab around, for instance,
button.
And yeah, so face down button. So that's the pile over there with the deck of cards.
Suit stack 1 empty hinted.
So I can keep, let me go down here.
Stack 4 number 4 king of hearts. Caps off.
Whoops, I'm hitting the wrong key. That's my
Caps
problem.
on.
Caps off. Let me go down here.
Stack 5 number 5 ace of diamonds hinted.
Okay, for instance,
Stack
so I could
2
take this
number
card
2
over
eight of
here,
spades.
the 8 of spades. I could say, okay, let's move it over there, hit enter. And now I can actually,
Stack 1 number 2 8 of spades. Stack 1 number 1 9 of hearts.
so I can also go up and down the stack. So not only did they make it accessible by giving us the names of these cards and the objects that we're moving to, but they also gave me keyboard accessibility. Notice I'm not using my mouse and moving these cards around. They gave me keyboard accessibility, and I'll get more into that in a little bit as well. So MSA is good in a lot of cases. It just is falling short with some of the rich information that we're starting to see come out with a lot of applications. So where do we go with MSA? So of all of these things, we got the OSM, we've got Win32, we've got MSAA now. IBM has kind of come up with a standard that they've now put up in open source called IA2 or iAccessible 2, which is a takeoff of MSAA. So this is another tool that you can use that goes beyond what MSAA limits are, well beyond what MSAA limits are, and allows you to give much more rich information. For instance, they've got their their whole Office lookalike application. I forget what it's called. But we can give the same rich information inside a Word document that they have using iAccessible 2 that we can with Word using the DOM, for instance. And iAccessible 2, of course, is a standard type interface, so we can deal with. So that is something that if you've already, what I typically tell people, if you've got MSA support already but you want more, then iAccessible 2 might be a good way to extend that and go beyond and maybe add some of that extra functionality that MSA wouldn't allow you to do. So iAccessible 2 is something that's just now coming out. Our 6.0 version of Windows just recently supported some of the new stuff that iAccessible 2 is providing. It's still an ongoing venture on both sides, the server side that's implementing it, as well as our client side that's actually using that. And then we've got the drastic kind of changeover, which Microsoft is recommending, is UIA, or UI automation, which is a kind of a whole different beast in itself. And I originally was telling people, if you've already invested in MSA, it's quite a change to go over to UIA to switch all of the stuff that you might have done. If you haven't started any accessibility yet, then shame on you. But if you have, then you may still be better off to go with iAccessible 2. But Microsoft is claiming that they still have an easy migration path to get people that have done MSA and go to UI automation. UI automation, in my mind, probably the long term is the better solution. In the immediate short term, in the next few years, probably IA2 is good to use. But in the long term, UIA is well thought out and definitely has the future in mind. So if you have a choice right now, I would start with UI automation and implement using those approaches. Now, one of the problems with UI automation right now is when the specs were originally written to be a UIA application, you had to be managed code, which was a huge restriction. Everybody was balking at that. So Microsoft finally got rid of that restriction now. So you don't have to be managed code. But they still have the managed code on the client side, our side, the Screenreader side. And so we're balking at that now. And so they're actually working on that as well. So until they remove the managed restriction on our side, we've not implemented any UI automation on them. And no AT product that I know of has actually implemented UI automation yet because of that. So that's something to consider also while you're dealing with all this. No AT yet supports UI automation. So we've got all of those things, and then one other mechanism that we can use is talk directly to the object model, or the DOM, the document object model, whatever. We can talk to those. Now the problem with that, of course, is every DOM is different, and we can't possibly write our code to talk to all the DOMs that are out there. So we'd prefer not to use that method. There are some people that have come to us and said, we've got a very rich DOM, we're not going to add UIA or MSA, and we want you to support this, and if it's a big enough application, like Office or something, we do that. So in Office's case, we do talk directly to the DOM, and we give very rich information from that. And I'll hopefully give you some examples inside Excel or Word or something to show that. But again, we prefer not to do that. And usually when we start writing it too, we find all sorts of problems in the DOM because nobody uses it. Inside Word, we found tremendous bugs and problems, but they fixed most of them. So we've got all those techniques, and the last technique is, of course, hacking. I mean, we have to make an application work. We'll do whatever we can to make that application work. So we can get very specific to an application, and we can say if it's this class name, and if it's this module, and if it's this dialogue, whatever, and the moon is full moon, whatever, we can then very specifically do something. And we've got tons and tons of hacks in there. Again, we prefer not to have to do that. So that's why we encourage developers to write their programs to be accessible from the ground up. And I would even consider labeling these graphics hacks. If you have to label a graphic, that usually means, I consider that a hack. That there should be some communication to tell us that's a nine of spades without us having to actually label that. So we give the user great customization. They can configure things. They can do their own customizations within an application if we don't work out of the box. But again, I consider if they have to do much of that, that's hacking on their part, and they really shouldn't have to do that. Or there are some cases like, for instance, if I'm inside Outlook, let's go into Outlook.
Microsoft.
This is Outlook 2007.
Office Outlook.
So as I go up and down this,
Unread.
so this is a good case of, this is not a standard list view here. It kind of looks like a list view in the inbox of Outlook, but it's not a standard list view. But we did just go in and we reclassed it, as I said before, because they subclassed this off of list views. So we sort of read it. The problem is those graphics don't come through on standard list views. So we had to go off and use our off-screen model to go pick up that graphic. We manually labeled that unread or read or whatever. If there's an attachment, we've labeled that. And this configuration pops up automatically when you're in here. So we can make the inbox work pretty good. But if you go into the calendar of Outlook, this is, I mean, one of the major blunders of Microsoft, and there are many. But the Outlook calendar just has no accessibility built into it. They put very little thought into it. They tried to give some basic functionality, accessibility just fell short. So trying to get this user interface is just too problematic to get it to speak. And some of our competitors are going out there writing very complicated scripts and things to try to get this. But if you just sneeze, the screen changes or whatever, all of a sudden everything breaks. It's giving wrong information. It tells me that there's an appointment when there's not, or it doesn't when it should. It's just too problematic. But Outlook is sort of a popular application, so we have to do something. So what we decided to do is, okay, heck with their UI. In our case, what we did was we said, let's make our own UI. So if I just as long as Outlook is running, it doesn't even have to have focus, but if Outlook is running, we can do insert C, which is our own command, and that pops up our own dialog, which basically makes a very accessible user interface. But this was overkill on we had no choice, we had to do this, but I went kicking and screaming as we did this. But this gives us full accessibility and full capabilities of all of Outlook Calendar, but our UI. I think if we had to do that for every application that's out there, it's just not feasible. But this has been extremely well received, and people are loving it as we're going through there.
Windows out.
I'll shut down that.
White space.
So that's the extreme of what we have to do to be able to create that dialogue. So we don't want to have to be able to do that. One of the other problems we have is security is always fighting with accessibility. When Vista came out, for instance, they broke us in so many ways because of accessibility. So we have to deal with all of that as well. And I don't know if you guys deal with that, of how you're trying to make sure that your data, your applications are accessible, secure, but yet we still need to make them accessible. Obviously, if Windows is at the secure login and it watches you type in your password, we could log that. I mean, that is a security risk, but we have to be there. We have to be there to be able to speak information as you're typing it and things like that. So there has to be a balance in there, and that's what we're fighting with Microsoft all the time as well. So what does it take to be a good accessible application? Obviously, you want full keyboard support. Again, turn off that monitor, turn it away, whatever. Try to use the mouse when you're interacting with your application. It's not going to work. So you have to make sure that your application is fully keyboard accessible. Solitaire, for instance, didn't used to have the ability to go up a stack. You could tab to the stack, but you couldn't arrow up to the previous cards. Well, that kind of makes it useless. And if you wanted to drag so many cards over, you had to use the mouse. So we gave you ways of being able to manipulate the mouse from the keyboard, but that's just a joke. So you want to make sure you give full keyboard accessibility when you're dealing with your applications. The tab order and things like that also have to make sense and have to be productive. I've seen so many dialogues where you tab and they're just going all over the place as you're tabbing around because nobody tried the keyboard tab order. They just created the dialogue without any thought to the tab order because they're using the mouse. Why would you care? So definitely need to make sure that the tab order is looking good. Keep losing my place. And also, well, some bad examples of things too are like inside Microsoft Word. I don't know if you've ever had even a basic document like that has columns. If you're in column 1 and you hit the down arrow key to go through it and you're at the bottom of column 1, where do you think you go when you hit down arrow? Well, you don't go to the top of column 2 where you'd think you would. You actually go below the columns. Or again, if you're in two-page mode and you're seeing 2 pages and you down arrow from 1 page, you don't go back up there. You go down below. And in tables, when you're down arrowing, there's no way to easily go sequentially through a table, line by line by line. Or if there's an embedded text field or text box inside a Word document, down arrow won't even take you into the text box. Blind person doesn't even know it's there. There's example after example of where Microsoft doesn't give you an easy way to even go through some basic, let alone complex Word documents. So in Word's case, what we did was we created our own hotkey to take you down a logical line. We're using the DOM. We'll take you through logically and we'll get you all the information that's there. Again, we had to do it because Office is popular, but cursor needs to be detectable. It's amazing how many different ways there are to put up a cursor on the screen. I mean, I think there are people out there just trying to break us. And I'm waiting for the one guy that just draws 1 pixel at a time up there. I don't know, there's got to be that guy up there that does it. But we have to go off, if you're not using system cursor, which has major limitations, which I understand why people don't use the system cursor all the time. But there are ways that you can put the cursor up. You can use MSA to let us know where the cursor is. Things like that would definitely help. So what we're doing now with most applications is we're watching the blitz or whatever they're using to put up on the screen. If it's within a certain parameter, if it's blinking and it's with certain width, then we consider that the cursor. We even have a keystroke that you can press. It's our auto detect cursor. If we're still not detecting it, you can hit this and we just sit back and we watch what's going on to the screen. And whatever blinks the most And then we track that, we say that's the cursor, and we will track that. We lock in on the ROP code, we lock in on the width and height, that type of stuff, and we lock in on it. So, but without the cursor, it's useless. I mean, if you're in a document and you don't have a cursor position, it's useless. So you've got to be able to do that. And it's some other examples of just some bad areas of, let's just say I go into, whoops, control panel, I go into power options.
Program system.
Where's the power options?
Programs and features. Power custom control.
So here's the power options dialog of Vista, for instance. And if I just tab through this, so I'm going, it will speak it, but I'm just going quickly. If I go down, and then I arrow down, we say custom control right in here. And what I could do is, I don't know if we've got enough time, but I could run AcEvent, which is an MSA tool that lets you see all of the events that are being fired with MSAA. Pardon? Sure, I'd love, yeah. With MSA, they give you some tools that I think are invaluable, and it's obvious that people that are implementing MSA don't always know about them, because if you just run it, you can see some really, you can find a lot of problems with your application. But let me just run, let's see, where is it?
Start, C, / AAA, seams, desktop, recycle bin.
Okay, I'm going to just move this around so we can hopefully see all of this. Changed my resolution on this screen when we got here.
OBJ net file left pulled option on top menu close name options.
What I'm going to do is just make sure that this tool always stays on top and then make sure it's showing us some information. So this is going to show us every MSAA event that's being fired, and this is how Windows is actually being able to tell what's going on in this application. But if I go up,
my custom plan 1 radio button checked.
Oh, somebody's time's ticking away. That's great. I should turn off that. But the last focus you can see was a roll of buttons, so that's why we spoke that button that's up there. But now if I down arrow to this,
custom control.
We got two focuses. We got a focus to the link, which was perfect, but then all of a sudden they decided to throw a row with a client as the role. So that's why we're saying custom control. So this is a bad example. Why Microsoft fired an event to client, I still don't understand. So we're going to have to go in and hack and say, okay, let's ignore the focus to client so that we can do that, and that's something we're going to do. We haven't released our Vista version officially yet. It's in public beta right now. So that's something we're going to have to do. So when you do it, I suggest you run AcEvent and you watch these events as they fire. Make sure you're getting the roles, the names, the states, all of that business is coming through as you would expect. Because if it's not coming right here, then we're definitely not going to read it right. So that's kind of a quick overview of where things are, what we have to do to be able to get things going. And our hacks and techniques and things are always growing, different ways of being able to do things, working with all sorts of manufacturers and producers of applications to try to come up with new ways and things like that. So we want you guys to use standard types of mechanisms to make it accessible. You've got the tools. We can point you in the right directions to be able to do that. And as Victor and I were talking as we were walking over to this building, is that if you build these in your standard controls that you deploy throughout many other departments, it's just going to work. I mean, it's just going to happen. So if we can get these things built in your standard core components that you're sharing to all the other groups, then all the better. And I talked with Todd, is it Todd Klutz? Yes. I mean, they're doing some wonderful work on the menu type gadgets that they're dealing with. And we were at a show before, we were doing a talk together. And he's made these menus become very accessible with the techniques that are out there, but it's just the menus. And then I go to like Yahoo and I go to the TV listings, which is very popular to blind users. It's garbage. It's not a standard table. You can't go through it, and it just doesn't work. So it's very frustrating. If they would just do, there's so many things that could be done. And I know it's just becoming aware, and it's a lot of legacy stuff that you have to deal with and do that. But it could be made very, very accessible. Also, just from a blind perspective, we put in some basic things to allow a blind user just quick access to things. Just to give you an example, for instance, time and date. We have a hotkey that just tells you the time that's going on. You and I could just real quickly look at the bar, or I don't have my sidebar open, but you could look at that. We give them keys, or the battery level.
Estimated battery charge 75%. Estimated life 2 hours 42 minutes.
So we just give them quick ways to be able to tell battery life or time and date, things like that. We throw in there to do that. So there's all sorts of techniques, or to read the title bar of the application, or the full text in the active window, or the current line, or all sorts of hotkeys. That there's probably around 300 different hotkeys that Windows offers, just depending on where you're at, what you're doing, of how you would actually deal with that. But anyway. And then we also have tons of verbosity, because as we're reading down through this information, you may or may not want to hear certain things. You can maybe be more productive if you're not hearing a lot of things. So at any point, a person can pop up, this is our verbosity dialog, and we group all of the verbosity into different groups over there called, when a window gets activated, what do we want to do? Do we want to say the word activated? Do we want to tell you the type of window that got activated? Do you want us to read the title bar? Do you want us to read the entire contents of the window, or only read it if it's a message box? That's just one thing of just activated that you deal with. But then also as you come down into browse mode, which is our mode of reading web pages, for instance, we break that down into a lot more element types of what do you want to hear. For instance, when you're on a web page, do you want to know about access keys? Let me tab over to
elements, acronyms,
do you want to know about acronyms and abbreviations on a web page? And if you do, how do you want to know? Do you want to hear IBM? Do you want to hear International Business Machine? Do you want to hear IBM International Business Machine? You can do that. Yes.
How much do you feel like users customize this stuff?
How much what, I'm sorry?
How much do you feel like users actually customize this stuff? I mean, in sort of, aside from people using assistive technology, most users just kind of, they use the default configurations, whatever.
It depends. The more advanced the user, obviously, the more they're going to tweak it. But so we try to set the defaults to what we think would be best for most users, but it's very easy to set this, and it depends on the web page too. I mean, this web page, maybe I need to know the acronyms because or whatever, and so they kind of tweak it.
Do you guys do anything like that, where you sort of, there's an assumption that there are things that you look for in a web page that are going to make you, treat it differently?
We haven't done a lot of that because we get ourselves in trouble. I mean, there are some things. We have like a simple example, we have a smart table mode because tables obviously are used a lot for formatting, not for real tables. So we don't want to tell you that there's 500 tables on that web page when they're really just used for formatting. So we try to go through and have some heuristics to try to figure some of that stuff out. They can turn off that smart mode. We have other smart modes where we try to weed out things that really aren't what they tagged, what they're, how they're tagged. They're really not used for that purpose.
I mean, this is kind of, I think, some of the feeling that talking to some developers that I've worked with, particularly people that are focused on accessibility already, some of the feeling is that some of the power that we're trying to bring with web standards, and a conference like this is really focused on web standards, is being missed because you guys are still trying to protect users from some of the hideous crap that's out there.
Well, that's true, because when W3C came out with their specs, we couldn't say that we were 100% W3C, because if we were, we would break existing pages that are out there. So you're right, we have hacks out there to do that. Those are getting better, and so we're always trying to follow that line of trying to make sure we don't break this stuff just so we can say we support the standards. And it's ongoing. I don't know that will ever get better just because there's legacy pages out there.
I just was wondering, how do you get the content out of the page? Do you wait for it to be in the DOM? Do you read the HTML straight? Is there a mixture of this? Where are you getting the data?
All of the above. But what we do is, well, let me just finish this. Yeah, I'll real quickly just go through some of the things that we can do, and then I'll launch IE, and you can actually see how we read a web page and things like that. I assume I have connectivity. I plugged in. I don't know. So just to real quickly go through some of these things. How do you want to do Flash, for instance? Do you want to know about Flash components? And if the Flash is tagged correctly using IE 7 only, or IE only, then we can actually make that Flash component accessible. Windowise was actually the first one to work with Macromedia to make that accessible. When you get to forms, you want to know the beginning and end of forms, or field sets, things like that. Do you want to know about headings? And you can easily navigate between a lot of these different element types from our hotkeys and things. When you have languages, do you want Windowise? If the synthesizer language is installed for whatever it's tagged as, we can switch to that on the fly and deal with that. So we get a lot of customers complaining. They go to a UK page or something, and it all of a sudden I can't emulate British English, so I won't try. But I'll let him do that. But it will switch over to British English, and everybody's like, what's going on? This is a bug in Windowise. It started speaking in British English, and that's because it was tagged for that. But they can certainly turn that off if you want to deal with that. How do you want us to represent links? We can tell you the same page links, and whether it's a visited link, lists. We can give you all sorts of stuff, long descriptions.
Miscellaneous. 10 of 15.
I'm not going to get into too many of those things, but one of the problems too with web pages is you can see we got the top 3 radio buttons up there. Do not suspend refresh, suspend flash refresh, or suspend all refresh. Once I get into a web page, you'll see how this works. But we go to a web page and we load it in and we make this accessible to the user, but then all of a sudden the web page changes from under them because it's redrawn every 30 seconds or 60 seconds. So we give the user the ability of just turning that off up here, so we can actually tell the browser, stop changing the web page from under me. It's very frustrating to try to read a page that's constantly changing.
New page information.
When a new page comes in, we can give you scads of information. All these different types that you see up there, we can expose to the user and tell them that these are on that web page. Okay? Only the ones that are checked you'll hear by default, but we have a keystroke that if you press it, it will actually give you all of this information as long as there's one or more of those element types that are up there. So a lot of rich information about the web page.
Objects.
What do you want to know about objects? If an object has alternative text, we have a keystroke that you can do to re-render that object to expose its alternative text.
Paragraphs.
Paragraphs, here's our smart paragraph mode where we try to get, even though you're not tagged in blank lines or things like that, we know that things are gapped differently, so we can kind of separate that off as a paragraph. Quotes, block quotes, tables. Tables are, we've got a lot of support for tables on how you want them not only to be read, but how do you navigate them, all that type of thing. All of this verbosity that you can set up in that. But let me go ahead and launch.
Menu, edit box, Internet.
IE.
Windows Internet Explorer. Custom control. Welcome to 35 links to unclick 6 headings. Link skip to main content. Link window eyes. Link rail sets. Link.
So what happened here at this point, this web page came in. We basically just using all sorts of techniques. MSAA, we talked directly to the IE DOM, to actually just those two techniques. We pull out to get this information. IE has no keyboard accessibility. I can't, as a blind user, arrow through this like I could inside Word. I don't have a cursor. I can tab between the links, but I can't go between the static text that's up there. So we had to come up again with a mechanism to be able to provide this. So what we do is it's kind of a virtual mode. We call it browse mode. This is a windowized mode. You can kind of think of it like being inside WordPad, for instance. It's an invisible environment that we've given to the user where now I do have a cursor. It's an invisible cursor, but I can go up and down, like I'm at the top right now. If I down arrow,
link skip to main content.
That's the very first hidden link. Skip to main content.
Link window eyes.
Link window eyes.
Link rail sets.
So I'm just down arrowing
Link
through my
small
text. I'm in a
filter.
static environment. IE doesn't have a clue what's really going on, other than when we go to a link, we tell IE to focus that link. But we're statically going through this. We've decolumnized the text. So if it's a table, it's decolumnized. If it's columns, it's decolumnized, all into a linear fashion that the user can then just go up and down through this text.
Link sets, link support.
So I can just down arrow all the way through this if I choose to, or I can hit a key that just says read it all the way to the beginning and end. That's the most simplistic way. But if you go to a web page the first time through, that may be your only choice. You may have to just read it top to bottom. Well, I mean, one of the biggest hurdles that you have when you go to web pages is just skipping through the junk and getting the main content.
Yeah.
And so we have some techniques to be able to do that. So some of the more popular things are H will take you to a heading.
Heading 3.
So it tells me I'm on a heading 3,
So does
wherever
that
that
take
is.
to the next?
The next heading that's there. Now, if I say I want to go to the next level 4 heading, I could type 4H,
no heading.
and there is no level 4 heading in that case. So I can jump to particular headings that I want to be able to deal with. And so we have keys to be able to jump to the next table, to the next heading, to the next list, those types of things. We have all those keys, or the previous. But we also have, in a lot of applications, whether I'm in Excel, Word, PowerPoint, IE, I can do what we call our page navigation dialog. So insert tab,
Link says.
pops up. This is our dialog, and this is a very quick way to get there. I think even quicker than some sighted people can find links on web pages. But if I wanted to know where, the training link, I could just pop that up, type TR, and hit enter, and I'm on it. As opposed to a sighted guy, oh yeah, and click on it. So I think that this can actually be quicker, especially on complicated web pages. So we bring up this dialog by default with all the links that are up there in web page order, but I can change it alphabetically if I want to. I can show all the frames if there are some tables, headings, lists, anchors, forms, all that can be shown up there. So this is a very popular technique that they will use to quickly focus in on what they really want as opposed to being thrown with all the other crap that's up there. So that's a very powerful mechanism that everybody uses. But while I'm in here, we also have, I'm going to just pop up our hotkey dialog.
Browse mode, menu.
Just going into our hotkey dialog for all the browse mode keys. So while I'm in a web page, these are all the keys that the user has. And there's how many?
Next colon, L1 to 48.
So there are 48 different hotkeys that we offer while you're in our browse mode. This is our virtual mode that you're in. So I can hit an L to go to the next link. So we have next and previous link, control, text. And the text is also a popular one that they use to try to skip all the garbage links or the whatever that's up there. So when I hit X, it will just take me to the next line in our virtual mode that's text. But you can also specify what is text. You can say it has to be at least so many lines of continuous text, or there has to be at least so many characters on this line for it to be considered text. Because again, you might see a link and then a vertical bar, which is text, and a link and a vertical bar. So so you can set those parameters to help you be able to jump through and get past all that stuff, frames and things. So if the page is tagged correctly, the user can navigate pretty quickly throughout all of this. It used to be a taboo to use frames because frames weren't accessible back in the old days, and now they are. I mean, back the way that we used to render web pages is a joke compared to what we've done now. So we've given you a much more richer way to be able to interact with this web page. But I mean, all of these keys, and I can go into great detail with all of these keys and ways we can navigate, which is great. It all breaks down when you start getting into more dynamic pages. Right now, we assume when we assumed that pages were mostly static, and they used to be. But now we're seeing much more richer content up on the screen on these web pages. They're constantly changing. Whole applications are being rendered in the browser. And so we need a different mechanism to be able to deal with that. So we have even, trying to think of a good form. If
Is this Windows OS 6?
This is 6.0. Well, actually, this was 6.1 because 6.0 didn't support Vista. And there definitely are techniques. I'm running out of time, but I'll show you. Let me launch Firefox because IBM has done some cool work within Firefox. Not within Firefox, but they're promoting some DHTML techniques to be able to make rich controls accessible. So a simple example of this is, and I think I saved a bookmark.
Accessible DHTML.
Well, here's a tree view. That's it's a pretty rich tree view that's being rendered in the browser. And now, in this case, to interact with any control, I didn't get a chance to show this, we can't be in our virtual mode. So I'm going to hit our key to get out of our virtual mode. And now we're basically back in this case, Firefox, just dealing with Firefox's control.
Veggies. Expanded 3 items, 1 of 3, depth 1.
So it basically gave me the same rich information you saw me give an example of a real tree view, and just deal with that.
Expanded 4 items, 1 of 3, depth 2.
All right, I can close it.
Green. Closed 1 of 3. Green.
So you can make
items,
more richer type of controls accessible if you follow this. So this is a tree view. There's several other examples that are up there, and we're working on more and more ways of making things. I know Todd Klutz, as I mentioned on menus, he gave great examples of making menus accessible. So you can still get these controls up there. You just have to know how to do it. So there are web pages that talk about this on where you can go. Todd has great resources of being able to find how you can do that. So my suggestion is make your control visually appealing as well as accessible. Same one.
So you guys are actually constantly reading the DOM?
No, in this case, they're actually firing this through MSAA. So we're getting events that are fired to us, and we're also able to query information through MSAA.
JavaScript is actually calling MSAA.
Right. Well, yeah.
I guess not all of it, but
What's that?
not all of the Java events are.
Oh, no. I mean, you've got to do. I mean, you've got work on your part to do it. But yes, right. You can set it up. You have the ability to be able to do all of that and make us read that. And so they give you specs on if you want to make it accessible, here's how to do it. So IBM is actually being very good about writing documentation on how to do all of this stuff.
Okay. As a developer of a Screenreader, and since we are the developers of the largest website in the world, is there something that we do that really pisses you off?
You asked me 30 seconds before my thing is due.
I mean, can you just kind of, what are we, I mean, I know we talk a lot about accessibility, and we talk a lot about web standards, but sometimes I feel like the input from, like, you're chasing us around and we're chasing you around, and it seems hard to find out what's the problem, where's the disconnect?
Well, I mean, I would just ask that each of you, and you mentioned you were in personals, I think it was, right? So if you try using that, turn off your monitor and try using that. And you were saying it's small numbers, and I was thinking, how do blind people, and I don't know, I shouldn't do this while he's here, but how do blind people meet other people? I would think that a lot of people have access to the web, and that would be a perfect place for them to go off and try to meet other people and do that type of thing. Yeah, if you have a choice of a page that's accessible or not, you're going to use the one that is. So, I mean, a lot of airlines, I think Southwest just recently got sued because their page wasn't accessible. They made it accessible, and now I think they're showing a big increase in their usage. So, well, just one last thought on that is I can excuse if you've got all this legacy stuff, and I understand it's a lot of work, but what I can excuse is when new widgets and things are being developed without accessibility in mind. That's the time to do it. Very little effort to do it when it's initially created. So if that, a lot of times the management aren't even aware of the accessibility. And so if you guys can pound on that or whatever, and we're available as a resource, I'll be glad to have our user base go hammer whoever and complain because certain things aren't accessible, like the TV, TV listings and things like that. But there's no way I can possibly talk about all of the things that we do, whether just out of web pages, in web pages, and things like that in an hour. But hopefully that gave you a little bit of an insight, some idea of what all the mechanisms we have to go through, and what a blind person has to go through to deal with inaccessible applications.
Do you know how this compares to the stuff that's like built into OS 10, for example, and sort of the Mac side of how this, because I know that there is sort of, I guess, a relatively primitive screen reader built into the operating system.
Well, even Windows has a primitive narrator that they have, which is very primitive, that puts out with it. But I don't know, you have the thought, I have good and bad thoughts about it. One is I don't know that I would want Microsoft to ever have their own screen reader like Windows. The reason Apple had to do it is because nobody would do it for them. They had a screen reader that was a pretty good screen reader, but they kept introducing new OSs without any thought to accessibility. They weren't helping them. They finally said, that's it, we're out of here, we're going to Windows. So they had nothing. They had to do something, and that's why they're producing their own right now. But they have no incentive to, in my mind, when the developer like Apple creates their own, they have no incentive to necessarily make other things really work well. They want to make sure their stuff kind of works, but they have no incentive to make it work really well because there's no competition. They just want to get enough to go by with ADA. Where under Windows, you have several, well, there's really only 3 major screen readers under Windows, ours being one of them. And so we're fighting, and that's what's making it better. The screen reader technology under Windows is far better than what Windows has. I mean, immensely better. And I think it's because of that competition. So if Microsoft ever had their own, I think that would be a disservice to the blind community. And I think Apple having their own, although it sounds good and blind people think it's great, but I think in the end it's going to be a bad thing.